Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. And before we get started, as I often do, So I'm your host, Jason Eck, and this week has been kind of interesting, and I'm sure many of you are in the same place, but I also recognize that some of you may have either had kids really early. Maybe you're just, like I said in other episodes, an early Xer, so your kids are already, either college age or grown out of the house, or you have younger kids, or a combination of both, frankly. I will tell you that there's a lot of big events, happening, milestones that people are reaching. And really what I've been discovering through this whole process, because it's a lot of firsts for us, we have our first high school graduate. All of our kids are going to be in high school or college. So one kid who is ending his 8th grade year at the school that they have all been at since pre-K, end of an era, really. And to have one going off to college in the fall, one, the youngest now going to be in high school, and kind of experiencing things that I think you forget sometime, right? You forget what it's like to be that age because we then become the parents. And I think we struggle, at least I do, because I know what I know, and my kids are better kids than I was. I was a hellion. Not the whole time. There were certainly a few years in my early teens, I was an absolute angel. Like, for real, I was a good kid. Until I wasn't, right? But I think about the emotional roller coasters that they're on, and that's really become more evident as they begin to form relationships, romantic relationships, how that changes kind of their mindset, their viewpoint of the world, because it's love outside of the family, or they think it's love. And sometimes it is. It's puppy love or first love or whatever it is. And I'll admit, when one of my kids, and I'm not going to say who it was, looks at me dead in the eye and goes, you just don't get me. You don't know what it's like. And it hit me. That hit me right in the gut. Because I do get it. It's just that we're so far removed from many of those emotions and those experiences. And we're looking back on it, sometimes nostalgically, but with the benefit of time. Right? Of wounds that are long healed, your failed relationships, or even, the excitement of a new relationship, particularly if you're someone who is in your first and, you expect to be only marriage. And I know for us, we're coming up on our 20th wedding anniversary, 25 years together. So, we're hoping to be lifers, and it's just an interesting space in time. And with all of the things that I've mentioned in prior podcasts, just the stresses of life, careers, and being in industries that have real challenges, that's a whole piece of it, which is where I kind of have this pie in the sky idea that, maybe podcasting could become a thing. But, just slogging away. And for any of you who are experiencing kind of the same things with parenting, I hear you. I empathize. I sympathize. It's hard. So if you're thinking, oh, well, my friends and their kids, they're all perfect. They're not. And I know that we all know that. We know that our friends and their kids might present as perfect angels, but if they're close enough friends, that they're not, because their kids are kind of like your kids, and you kind of know warts and all, the challenges. So anyway, you're not alone. Do your best, do your best. Chances are, unless you are very, very fortunate, you're doing a better job. Honestly. It's, that's the kind of thing that I look at. And, if you don't have strong role models, particularly strong marital, role models. I'm a product of divorce and didn't have those kind of things. To me, it's so important that with all the other things that do come with being a teenager, the hormones, the emotions, the relationships, all of those things, and not just romantic relationships, friendships and school cliques and all of that stuff, to just, if nothing else, provide that strong framework. That goes such a long way. Something that I really wish that I'd had, and that was so important for me to make sure that my kids have a nice, stable home life. It hasn't been without challenges, I mean, I have, I've talked about it on the show, drank too much, yelled too much, been either too distant or, not present. It's okay as long as you try and you make amends and you do your best. So that's my little prologue for the evening, the little life stuff that I like to sprinkle in there. So I don't know if anyone's paying attention to the news. As I often say, I recommend that you don't. Now, you might think when I begin to talk about the subject that I'm going down a political road. Now, I'm not. It just so happens that something that is political that's happening made me think about a topic that I've been bandying about. And I am not anywhere near an authority. I'm not an authority on anything, truly. And it's this whole thing about Russia and Russian collusion. And then you have like the whole Ukraine piece and all that kind of stuff. And if there's something that our generation has been acutely aware of, and definitely, boomers into X and millennials haven't experienced this, and Gen Z or whatever it is, they don't know truly what the Cold War is like. So that's what tonight's topic is, the Cold War, and going through kind of a timeline, because it's so fascinating to me. Because if you believe anything that Orwell says, right, and I think that Orwell was, he was more Nostradamus than Nostradamus, right, in the things that he was seeing that were happening in, areas of industry and politics and socialism, communism, capitalism, like all these different things. And he always talked about how history is kind of written by the victors. That's true. And how you can rewrite history. But there's also the fact that the enemy is whoever the state has decided is the enemy. So I look at from a historical perspective, and it blows my mind when I stop to really ponder it from this perspective. And I'm not talking about like conspiracy theories or anything like that. I'm just talking about the utter coincidence, if you will. Now, look, the whole coincidence thing, are they really coincidences? That's where the conspiracy theory, kind of starts up. But I've talked a lot about sitcoms and TV and episodic programming. And I've come to realize that in the history of the world, you have these just repeats. You have reruns. And it's so fascinating to me. I mean, you could go back and you could look at like the time of the Crusades, right? And the spread of Islam through the Middle East, right? And then you look at all these different points in time where, okay, now Islamic extremists are now at the forefront. Like they're in the news. This is the new enemy. And then, of course, it was Russia, right? And you can go back and it was Germany twice. But then you have communist East Germany, right? And the spread of communism into Asia. And then, wait, it's Islam again. Oh, wait, maybe there's some Nazis over here. Oh, wait. Oh, is it domestic terrorism? Like what? It's on a repeat. It's on a rerun. You know? So I thought I would kind of do a little bit of a history of the Cold War from our lifetime. So what I decided to do was I often will try to find a logical starting point for anything that is kind of a historical dive, right? So for the purposes of tonight's episode, I'm going to take into account the early Xers are 65. So I'm going to start at approximately when they're 10 years old. In part because I think that by 10, your memories are so absolutely solid. And that if a significant event happens, you clearly remember it. So one of the things that, before I go through different timelines and kind of explore the history of the Cold War in our lifetime, I'd mentioned the movie Red Dawn and how it scared the crap out of me when I was a kid. Because the thought of a Russian invasion, while completely, even at that time, just crazy talk, because we are already in the era of mutually assured destruction, they were an enemy. Like, this was powerful and palpable that we knew, if nothing else, our enemies were the Russians, the USSR, right? Think about your movies. Every action flick, it's going to be, the Viet Cong in, Rambo or whatever, you know what I mean? And I'm sure Schwarzenegger, it was Russians in one of them. It's just Rocky, it's just Russians were the bad guys. So looking at it from that kind of perspective, or even the duck and cover, or turn over your desk or your science table at school, because this is going to stop a nuclear bomb, right? This is literally what we were taught, that there was a significant risk of nuclear war, and that was how we were going to either A, survive it, or, I don't know, just make it easier to handle. I don't know. It was crazy. But the Russians were the big bad of the world. But then when I start to read through things that were happening, so in 1975, I was alive at this point. So these things happening in my lifetime is also really fascinating. So first and foremost, the first thing that comes up when you go to 1975, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, right? The Khmer Rouge, that's Pol Pot's group, the communist group, seizes power in Cambodia and immediately order civilians to evacuate the capital. Now, I may have mentioned this before, but when I was working, one of my first jobs in the hotel business, I was doing payroll, and the person who trained me, he was from Cambodia, and he left with his family on foot. But most of his family didn't make it. But the whole thing was, you just keep walking. Just keep walking. And eventually you'll get somewhere, kind of thing. And he made his way to the United States. And he was approximately, I want to say he's probably like 10 years older than me, right? So that would have put him right at this age where he would have been fleeing at around 10 or 11 years old. I mean, just mind-blowing, In April 30th, North Vietnamese troops, Saigon falls, which essentially was the true end of the Vietnam War, because the communists won, right? So that's why we were in Vietnam. It was to halt the tide of communism, or the spread of communism, because President John F. Kennedy, former military, World War II, had a very strong aversion to communism and felt it was important. Now, of course, he was assassinated before that war began. The war began under LBJ. So there has been a lot of revisionist history in that, as well as whose war was it. It was LBJ's war, make no mistake about it. That's when it began. But obviously, it lasted far longer than it should have. It was unwinnable. So then, in June, communist groups seize power in African nations, Angola and Mozambique. And now they're in civil war. So within just a few months, you have communism spreading to two distinct parts of the world, Africa and Asia. In July, here's what's interesting. The U.S. and the USSR undertake their first joint space mission, the Apollo-Soyuz project, marking the end of the space race. Now, isn't that interesting? Because we know the Cold War continued. It continued for another decade approximately, decade and a few. So it's also so interesting that they are the big bad, yet here we are in a joint venture, the two world superpowers. That in of itself should kind of tell you something, right? Now, I'm not reading into it, no conspiracy theory here, but clearly there was some communication. And then August 1st of 1975, the Helsinki Accords. 35 states agreeing to improve relations and communication with the communist nations. Well, now because you've had so much of a spread of communism to all these different areas, much more powerful as a, I guess, not even diplomatic, but from a negotiation perspective, right? So you kind of have to come to the table because we're talking about world commerce, world economies, interstate and international trade. All of these things are very, very real. And then on November 29th, also 1975, a nationalist communist group seizes power in Laos. Okay? So that's a lot of movement. And when you consider that we're talking about communism as we know it was started, late 30s, right? And then really fully bloomed into the 40s, right? So you go from, Lenin to Stalin. It's just now firmly entrenched. So now we're going to jump around a little bit. I just thought it was a good starting point to look at and go, holy cow. But just to think about Pol Pot in our lifetime, that is just a historical footnote almost at this point, which it shouldn't be. That's genocide of his own people, right? All in the name of communism, power. 1976, the Philadelphia Flyers defeat HC Siska Moscow 4-1, and the match is marred by tension and a threatened walk-off by the Soviet team. So here we are, trying to play nice, using a game that's now international, and it's still tensions brewing. You have in Argentina, you have an overthrow of the president. You then have a terrorist attack at the Soviet embassy in Beijing, where 4 Chinese civilians are killed. The socialist government in Poland raises food prices, sparking strikes. Now, I remember, not obviously in 76, I was only 2 years old, but I do remember their talk about, food strikes, food prices, like just basic goods. And they talk about, it's very, I guess, stereotypical at this point, but bread lines, etc. But I do remember those being real things that would be shown on the news. East Germany hosts a multilateral conference for European communist parties. It is attended by representatives from 29 different parties. North and South Vietnam are formally reunified, whether the South likes it or not, and the Soviet Republic of Vietnam is proclaimed. Now, here's interesting. I remember this, but only as literally a textbook. Soviet military pilot Viktor Belenko. Now, as soon as I say the name, I'm sure some of you go, oh my gosh, yes, I remember that name. Viktor Belenko defects to the U.S. after landing his MiG jet in Japan. Belenko is later given U.S. citizenship by an act of Congress. So here's another mind blower when I read it. Because if you think back to Revolution by the Beatles, right? I wasn't born yet, but the death of Chinese leader Mao to think to be alive when Mao was. I saw that. I'm like, no kidding. In my lifetime, I breathed the same air as Mao. Curious. And then November 2nd, 1976, Jimmy Carter is elected 39th president of the United States, defeating incumbent Gerald Ford. That was a electoral college win for Carter because he won fewer states, 23 to Ford's 27. Major things are happening, right? But I think you start to see a little bit of a weird theme and how things become mirror images for each other just in life and international politics. Jimmy Carter inaugurated in January. In his first address to the United Nations, Jimmy Carter promises his foreign policy will focus on protecting human rights around the world. Now, love him or hate him, what your particular stance is. I truly believe, if nothing else, that Jimmy Carter truly believed that he wanted to do good things for people. I really do. Whether I agree or disagree with the approaches that he took, because I think with every president, there's like things that you should agree with or disagree with. Like you should never believe 100% or dismiss 100%. There's things that are, I think inherently you should have something that you agree with, right? His foreign policy, though, ended up becoming a problem, and we'll talk about that just a little bit later on because it'll be part of this history. So then we have the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization is formally dissolved because now, communism is in full bloom across the Pacific Rim. The London Club Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement lays down guidelines for the sale and transfer of nuclear materials and equipment, and the agreement is signed by the U.S., the USSR, and 15 other nations. So remember, nuclear non-proliferation means we're not going to continue to grow our arsenals. We have continued to build our arsenals. It's truth. But on April 7th, so again, this guy seems to be trying to do his best. Jimmy Carter suspends production of a planned neutron bomb. Interesting. But then on April 20th, 1978, and you early Xers, I'm sure you probably remember this. Korean Airlines Flight 902 makes an emergency landing on a frozen lake in northern Russia after being shot and crippled by Soviet air defenses. The passengers and crew are rescued by Soviet helicopters and later released. So now, this is where the cyclical nature of things comes into play very clearly in my mind. And I'm not sure the full history and the meaningful, placement of this country as, somewhat of a bridge to different parts of the world. But on April 28th, the president of Afghanistan, Mohammed Dawood Khan, is assassinated by the Socialist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan and the formation of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan under Nur Muhammad Tariqi, a socialist politician. This begins a long history now of, so we haven't mentioned the Russians' peace in Afghanistan yet, but this is where it begins. So, June 21st, 4 Iranian helicopters are shot down by Soviet air defenses after straying into Soviet airspace during an exercise. Can't imagine that went over particularly well. Now, here's the part. Every time I see the name. So I know that this man I'm about to mention was on the front page of the newspaper on the day that I was born because he was welcomed and did a whole, car procession with then President Richard Nixon. I'm talking about Anwar Sadat, So after almost 2 weeks of negotiations at Camp David, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli leader Menachem Begin, I always forget, sign a landmark peace agreement. So that's very true, that with all of the strife and unrest in the Middle East, Egypt was the first country to try to normalize relations with Israel. Now, as you will come to learn soon, that wasn't necessarily received particularly well by everyone within Egypt. And then on Christmas Day of 1978, after weeks of tension and skirmishes between Vietnamese troops and the Khmer Rouge, Vietnam launches an invasion of Cambodia. Wow. I think part of it is also, it gives me some strange comfort to know same shit, different decade. I think the only difference, or the main difference, is now I'm a parent. And I look at the world differently because I have people that I want to protect differently. So I think my lens on all this, like, the world is madness. Let's see here. So now we are in 1979. The United States and the People's Republic of China formally commence diplomatic relations. And now China has entered the chat. Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain after the Conservative Party wins a general election. Pope John Paul II becomes the first pope to visit a communist nation, okay, arriving for 9 days in his native Poland. U.S. President Jimmy Carter and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT II Treaty, limiting nuclear weapons, recurring refrain. And now here's a name that you will also remember and certainly continued to be in the news in various different ways for many years to come. So it's 1979. We're going to be talking about them for a long time, and that is the Sandinistas, a Marxist guerrilla movement who seized control of Nicaragua. Carter authorizes the CIA to provide aid and equipment to the mujahideen in Afghanistan. That is very, very important because the mujahideen were the freedom fighters who wanted to expel the socialists, the communists, the Russians, the Soviets. And they were, of course, armed by the U.S. And that relationship is ultimately what gave very strong firepower to some guy named Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. November 4th, Iranian students invade the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and detain 53 Americans. This marks the start of the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, that was probably more than anything the defining event of Jimmy Carter's presidency. And I believe that the approach was considered to be subpar and showed a kind of deference. We hear we don't negotiate with terrorists, and basically it's showing weakness, or at least that's how those who are looking at like world military and espionage and all those kind of things. And, you can't show relative weakness to a terrorist group. Otherwise they gain power is what it comes down to. So yeah, the Iranian hostage crisis. Now I seem to remember, so let's see, at this point I would have been 5 years old. I vaguely remember my dad talking about this. Like, again, really vague, but I'm sure that, you older Xers are going, yeah, that was like a big deal. That was a big, big deal. And let's see, U.S. defense computers at NORAD report an incoming Soviet nuclear attack, leading the mobilization of planes and missile crews. Cross-checking soon reveals the attack was triggered by by a training simulation mistakenly uploaded to NORAD's computers. That would have been bad. So whenever we start talking about like the presence of AI, imagine if like AI is just like, screw it. Let's just do this. You know what I mean? Let's just get it done. Mutually assured destruction. That's the thing, man. Good grief. Imagine that was almost the end. Oh gosh, that would have been so bad. Let's see. Margaret Thatcher addresses the House of Commons and exposes art historian Anthony Blunt as a former Soviet spy. Is that Emily Blunt's father? And then on December 24th, Soviet forces invade Afghanistan to support the weakening communist government there. Wow. It's just the parallels and how these things, like this is where when we start talking about international diplomacy and people think either too blasé about it or perhaps too aggressively about it, it is necessary if what we think to be true is true. Because obviously we know, regardless of anything else, we know that the information that we receive is going to be sanitized in some way, shape, or form, right? Which is why if it were actually possible to have like strong, I don't want to get into the whole Twitter thing, but if it was possible for people who are, in some Soviet nation, like at the time, if something like that existed, that we could communicate to each other, like the people, like the actual citizenry, like we're the people of these nations, not our governments. And imagine if we had an opportunity to talk to each other for real, right? It would be different, but everything gets sanitized. Everything comes through some filter. And here we are, like I said earlier, same shit, different decade. And you look at how the different pieces, because it is diplomacy, you're not thinking like the way they say checkers versus chess. If you're only thinking in a really short-term way, think about how we're arming these freedom fighters, the mujahideen in Afghanistan, and how that would yield negative results for our nation 3 decades later. You just don't know. There's all these different pieces. So now, let's go to the 80s, right? I don't remember this. United States halts wheat sales to the Soviet Union, a sanction imposed after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Fascinating. No wheat for you. U.S. President promises to respond to any Soviet aggression against American allies in the Middle East. This position becomes known as the Carter Doctrine. So, all right, taking a tough stance. Now, again, I was little, so if I have anything off, please let me know in the comments, email me, whatever. Just say, hey, you got this piece wrong. I am always willing to learn. The U.S. severs diplomatic relations with Iran. Makes sense. The U.S. military launched a failed attempt to rescue American civilians being held during the hostage crisis. 8 American servicemen are killed. That's where I think the negative blowback happened, that it was unsuccessful and servicemen were killed in action. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Tbilisi Rock Festival begins in Georgia. The country, Georgia, the first rock music festival held in the Soviet Union. It is dubbed the Soviet Woodstock because you know what? They still want to have a good time, right? Got to have some opiate for the masses, as they say. President Carter announces the U.S. will boycott the Olympic Games in Moscow. Josip Tito, socialist leader of Yugoslavia, dies in Belgrade at 88. A device fault causes U.S. defense computers in several locations to report an incoming attack of Soviet missiles. Wow. That's just frightening. Frightening. On July 19th, the 22nd Summer Olympic Games begin in Moscow, and a total of 65 nations refused to attend due to a U.S.-led boycott in protest against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Afghanistan. Let's see here. War breaks out between the Islamic State of Iran, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Ba'athist Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein. That continued on and on and on. The Iran-Iraq war lasts almost 8 years and claims up to 60,000 lives, some from the use of chemical weapons. But were there chemical weapons? Right? It's just the same stuff. It's the same stuff. Republican candidate and former California governor Ronald Reagan is elected president. Reagan defeats the incumbent president, winning 44 states to Carter's 6. Think about that. 44 states to 6. That is a tremendous margin of victory. Like, that's a whooping. 1981. Ronald Reagan is inaugurated as the 40th U.S. president, and his speech focuses mainly on domestic and economic issues and not international diplomacy. Curious, right? After 444 days in captivity, the 52 American civilians held hostage in Iran are released. But I mentioned this next one on my episode of events that shaped Gen X. 2 months after his inauguration, Ronald Reagan is shot in the chest while leaving a Washington hotel, and the gunman John Hinckley is found to be mentally unhinged and obsessed with Jodie Foster. And then, just 2 months later, while riding in an open-topped car through the Vatican, Pope John Paul is shot 4 times in the abdomen and right arm. The gunman, Mehmet Ali Agca, is a Turkish Kurd with uncertain motives. His motive was murder. And then, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat is assassinated by Islamist military officers. March 30th, the President of the United States is nearly assassinated by a deranged gunman. Look, I'm not saying there's false flags or that there's MK Ultra or anything like that. All I'm saying is, then you have this guy shoot the Pope in the Vatican, unknown motives, and then the Egyptian president. So you have the head of the United States, you have the head of the Catholic Church, and you have the head of the nation of Egypt, which has normalized relations with Israel, assassinated by Islamist military officers. The world is a crazy place, but it always has been. Let's see. Ronald Reagan endorses a joint resolution of Congress calling on the Soviet Union to cease its abuses of the basic human rights of its citizens, in particular the right to freely practice one's religion and the right to emigrate to another country. Oh, wow. Argentinian forces invade the Falkland Islands, a self-governing British territory in the South Atlantic Ocean. This leads to the Falklands War. Remember that? Spain joins NATO. And a nuclear disarmament rally in Central Park, New York, attracts an estimated 750,000 people, and they hear addresses from prominent peace activists and musicians. Now, ultimately, I do believe, rightly or wrongly, okay, call me naive, call me crazy, fine. I do think that mutually assured destruction is, I don't know, it leads a lot of faith on leaders of nations to be like, okay, I don't really want to do this, right? You don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. So I guess it does become challenging when some nations are not allowed to develop their nuclear potential because then they have a chance to negotiate from a position of strength. He who has nukes has significant sway in the world. Like, that's what it comes down to, right? He who has the power to blow up the world, that's what it comes down to, honestly. Argentina surrenders to British forces, bringing the Falklands War to an end and liberating the islands. Man, I mean, just Argentinians I know are just some fucking cool people. Oh, there's my one F-bomb. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev dies in Moscow after a heart attack. He's replaced 2 days later by former KGB chief Yuri Andropov. Let's see. Dieter Gerhardt, a former officer in the South African Navy, is arrested for espionage in New York. Ooh. U.S. President Ronald Reagan, get this, February 2nd of 1983. U.S. President Ronald Reagan hosts a delegation of Afghan mujahideen, the freedom fighters, at the White House. Think about that and everything that we know subsequent to that event. March 23rd, Reagan unveils his Strategic Defense Initiative, a program to research and develop missile defense, later dubbed Star Wars. June 3rd, War Games, a motion picture depicting a computer simulation that almost triggers World War III. You know, so everything that we know, simulations, the tests, false whatever, that almost happened for real. That's not just a Hollywood story at all. Wow. Samantha Smith, a 10-year-old girl from Maine, visits the Soviet Union at the invitation of Yuri Andropov. Smith had earlier written asking Andropov if he intended to wage war on America. I mean, you know, they say you let kids have a voice and they're going to want peace, you know? I mean, you don't always listen to kids because kids have some far out theories about things. But, yeah, that was a reasonable question. And kudos to him for saying, you know what? Let's bring this little American girl. Look, we don't want to have a war, but we're also at odds. We don't see governance the same. Soviet MiG fighters shoot down a civilian airliner, Korean Air Flight 007, after it overflew Soviet territory. The crash kills all 269 people on board. Ronald Reagan addresses the nation on a Soviet attack on Flight 007, calling it a crime against humanity. And this is also where he dubs them the evil empire. After days of denial, Moscow admits that the Soviet fighters were responsible for shooting down Flight 007. A Soviet Air Force officer, Stanislav Petrov, averts nuclear war by ignoring computer reports of 5 incoming missiles. The reports are later found to be false, caused by cloud reflections. Bro, Stanislav Petrov. Wow, dude, you took a gamble, and you were right. I remember reading something about that, though. He had reasons to believe what he believed. I'd have to go back and look. So anyone knows that, let me know. U.S. forces land in Grenada to overthrow the communist military regime and expel Cuban troops there. I remember that. Because every time like something is launched, it's not like a war, but a military exercise. It became news, even for, kids. It's like, wait, your country is engaging in warfare. U.S. deploys nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles at Greenham Common in Berkshire, England. The site is surrounded and blockaded by anti-nuclear weapons protesters, most of them women. Oh, I remember this, guys, gals. The day after, a movie depicting a nuclear attack on American cities is aired on U.S. television. That was heavy. And I think this is what led to some of those fears as a kid. Like, this is what we're looking at. Wow, I'd have to go back and see that. It's been a minute. And Soviet delegates walk out of the arms reduction talks in Vienna, a protest against the deployment of U.S. cruise missiles in Europe. How long have we been hearing about U.S. cruise missiles? Well, like 40 years. So let's see, 1984. Konstantin Chernenko becomes General Secretary of the Soviet Union following the death of Yuri Andropov. Let's see. There's a fire at a naval base in northern Russia, which burns for 4 days, and it causes a series of munition blasts that kill as many as 300 people and destroy much of the Soviet Union's naval missile stockpile. How'd that happen? And now I remember this so clearly. The 23rd Summer Olympic Games commence in L.A. These games are boycotted by the Soviet Union and 13 of its communist allies. Hey, turnabout is fair play. U.S. went ahead and boycotted the games in Moscow. Right back at you. And I remember that being a big deal. And just specifically, I remember that because it's summer games, right? So we're off for the summer from school. And I just remember being in Rhode Island at my aunt and uncle's house when these events were on and just watching the Olympics because that was must-see TV. You didn't have 900 channels. You watched the Olympics. It was a big freaking deal. While warming up for a radio address, Ronald Reagan quips that he had outlawed Russia forever and that we begin bombing in 5 minutes. Hot mic. We got a hot mic. We got a hot mic over here. Excuse me. And President Ronald Reagan is elected for a second term, defeating Democratic candidate Walter Mondale. Reagan wins almost 59% of the popular vote and carries 49 of 50 states. These are huge margins of victory. And here we are closing out 1984 with UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher holding cordial meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev, a member of the Soviet Union Politburo and a future general secretary. Yeah, his name will come up, won't it? So let's see. How are we doing on time here? Okay, so let's see if we could get through the 80s. Okay, so his doctrine is different than Carter's, which is Reagan announces his administration will arm and support freedom fighters against communist regimes. Hindsight 2020 on that one, you know? And then Mikhail Gorbachev becomes general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He's an interesting guy, so let's see here. On the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declares a 5-month moratorium on nuclear testing. The U.S. refuses to reciprocate. Good grief. International politics. And then Gorbachev and Reagan meet for the first time at a 3-day summit in Switzerland. They agree to more meetings in the future. So while not a Cold War item, here we are in 1986. And the Space Shuttle Challenger explodes January 28th, killing all 7 astronauts on board. I mentioned that is one of the events that has shaped our generation. After years of popular unrest, a series of demonstrations in the Philippines leads to the removal of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Remember that? That was a huge deal. Huge deal. Speaking at a Communist Party Congress, Mikhail Gorbachev unveils the keywords of his reformist policy, glasnost and perestroika. So they were introduced to try and deal with economic stagnation, right? So it was really meant to say, hey, we have to do something different in order to compete on a global scale economically. It wasn't just being like the top, like military complex, right? There had to be more to it. April 26th, 1986, the Soviet nuclear reactor at Chernobyl, Ukraine explodes, killing 56 people and contaminating a large area. The Chernobyl disaster has long-lasting physical, social, and economic consequences. What's so fascinating, there's a documentary. There are people living there. Like they never left. It's crazy. Crazy to stay there. Let's see. The opening ceremony of the first Goodwill Games is held in Moscow, created by Ted Turner. It was designed to heal the acrimony created by the 1980 and 1984 Olympic boycotts. Reagan and Gorbachev meet for a second time in Iceland, but the meeting fails to reach an agreement on arms control. Reagan has prostate surgery, addresses the nation on television, and denies approving or ordering the sale of arms to Iran in order to fund the Contras movement in Nicaragua. Iran-Contra scandal. Remember that? Oliver North, he testified. So, Soviet General Secretary now announces that open debate, glasnost, and economic reform, perestroika, are now policies. Like, that's what we're doing. Western musicians, including David Bowie, Genesis, and the Eurythmics, perform in West Berlin, close to the Berlin Wall. A large crowd of East Berliners gather on the other side to listen and ignore police orders to disband. It starts there. Right? While visiting Berlin, Ronald Reagan delivers a speech that urges Soviet General Secretary to tear down this wall. An American singer-pianist, Billy Joel, completes a brief tour of the Soviet Union, performing in Moscow, Leningrad, and Tbilisi. And then December 8th of 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev begin a 3-day summit in D.C. where they sign a treaty banning all medium-range nuclear missiles from Europe. Like, it's moving along. It really does come down to Reagan and Gorbachev. Now, did they do plenty of things they probably shouldn't have? Absolutely. But these nations needed to cut it out. So the Soviet Union passes the first legislation that implements Gorbachev's perestroika. But then, even after all this talk, making nice, there's a naval clash between the U.S. and USSR vessels after U.S. ships enter Soviet waters in the Crimean Sea. Crimea, which is a big part of what's happening where? Ukraine, what is happening right now as we speak. You see? All the same stuff. All the same locales, countries, land masses. A McDonald's restaurant opens in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, the first in the Soviet bloc nation. Let's see. Approximately 5,000 Catholics participate in a candle demonstration demanding religious freedom in Slovakia. The U.S., USSR, and Afghanistan and Pakistan signed the Geneva Accords. Now, we've all heard the Geneva Accords a million times. It all started here. The agreement provides a timetable for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, resulting in ultimately a power vacuum that gave rise to the Taliban. Moscow begins withdrawing Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Reagan and Gorbachev have 5 days of talks in Moscow. They sign a treaty restricting intermediate-range nuclear forces. Soviet Congress passes a further round of economic reforms, lessening the Communist Party control over economic policy. So then Bruce Springsteen performs a 4-hour concert in East Berlin and is attended by an estimated 300,000 East Germans. Okay, so here we are. August 11th, 1988. I am a freshman in high school. Or I'm about to be a freshman in high school, I should say, on August 11th. Saudi-born mujahideen Osama bin Laden forms an Islamic military group called Al-Qaeda. There it is, right there. That has a straight line to 9/11, 2001. Wow. Ronald Reagan orders that the U.S. Embassy in Moscow be torn down and rebuilt due to an infestation of KGB listening devices. I thought I was going to say rats. I guess it's the same thing. Oh, that's amazing. And then incumbent Vice President George Bush wins the U.S. presidential election, defeating Democratic candidate and former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. So here we are, 1989, the last year of the 80s. George Bush is inaugurated as U.S. president, replacing Ronald Reagan. The last Soviet troops are withdrawn from Afghanistan. The death of Hu Yaobang, a liberal reformist official in the Chinese Communist Party. Students respond to Hu's death with large gatherings in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere. So that's April 15th. On April 26th, the People's Daily, the official state newspaper of Communist China, publishes an editorial condemning the growing student demonstrations. The following day, up to 100,000 students marched through Beijing to Tiananmen Square. Meanwhile, the Hungarian government begins tearing down the barbed wire fence along its border with Austria. The world is starting to open up. Gorbachev makes a landmark visit to China in an attempt to normalize Sino-Soviet relations. Student gatherings, protests, and hunger strikes continue during his visit. With student protests and calls for democratic reform growing, the communist government in China declares martial law. This is 1989. June 3rd, Chinese military units are sent to Beijing to clear protesters from Tiananmen Square. Over the next 24 hours, now here's where the numbers are vague, between 300 and 3,000 protesters are killed. I mean, that's sobering. That's sobering. Footage of a lone protester standing defiantly in front of a column of tanks in Beijing is beamed across the world. It becomes an iconic image of protest against communist oppression. Poland completes 2 rounds of democratic elections, the country's first free election since World War II. Let's see. Christian Democratic politician Tadeusz Mazowiecki becomes Prime Minister of Poland. Hungary adopts a new constitution allowing for multiple political parties and free elections. Erich Honecker is replaced as the leader of the East German Communist Party. Gorbachev repudiates the Brezhnev Doctrine, the idea that Moscow could intervene in Soviet bloc nations if socialism was perceived to be under threat. He's like, hey, got to let it open back up. That was a huge thing with the Soviet bloc nations at that time. And the East German government announces that it will shortly open checkpoints in Berlin. This triggers the storming and eventual fall of the Berlin Wall. Wow. So, meanwhile, in Romania, dictator Nicolae Cusco is overthrown after 34 years in power. Cusco and his wife are swiftly executed. And then finally, on December 29th of 1989, the last year of the 80s, playwright and anti-Soviet dissident Václav Havel is elected as the president of Czechoslovakia. I can't help but find this truly interesting and a powerful kind of exercise in what the human condition is and what, I guess, thresholds people have before they say no more. And how ultimately, if people in power don't do something to basically, I guess for lack of a better term, intervene on behalf of their people instead of intervening against their people. So you think about that switch in the USSR of control. Now, look, to think that like the KGB just disappeared and there was no longer espionage and that the old vestiges of communism didn't still exist. Well, we know that's not true, right? Putin came out of that whole thing. He used KGB, right? It's not the same kind of freedoms, but this was such a change. And we saw it in our lifetime. So it's not included here because I'm sure it is, let's see, in 90, When was the Moscow Music Peace Festival? Let's see. Oh, they didn't include it on here. Well, why the heck not? That's actually really important. They mentioned the Soviet Woodstock. So let's see here. The Moscow Music Peace Festival took place August 12th through 13th, 1989, at Central Lenin Stadium, now called Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow. It occurred during the Glasnost era, and it marked the first time hard rock and heavy metal acts from abroad were granted permission to perform in the capital city. Over 100,000 people attended. And we got the pay-per-view. I say we, me, Nicole, we ordered it because like the bands were all the bands that we were listening to. It was Cinderella. You have Russia's own Gorky Park, right? Soviet metal band, amazing. Nuance, Brigada S. I'm not sure what that is. I don't remember that. The Scorpions, Skid Row, Motley Crue, Ozzy Osbourne, and Bon Jovi, with a special guest, Jason Bonham, son of John Bonham, late of Led Zeppelin. I mean, it was a huge deal, and this was literally what we were watching before our eyes was an end to the Cold War. But there is the part of me that says, did it ever truly end? Why is it that Russia is still this big bad? And that's really what spurred this whole thing on. Russian conspiracy theories and election interference, and this is happening and that is happening, and, you know, Russian hackers and the invasion of Ukraine, like when it happens, like how all these things happen. When do things happen in relation to elections? It's all so curious. Perhaps coincidental, perhaps by design, if you start getting into conspiracy theories. You know, do we live in a computer simulation? I don't know. Elon Musk seems to think, maybe. But a lot of scientists have actually theorized that this is all some kind of big experiment. And certainly humanity and all these different forms of government have always been experiments. And people have talked about the United States in its formation of being a great experiment in democracy and a constitutional government. So yeah, that's the history of the Cold War in our lifetime. And I think it's appropriate to kind of end where it does with the fall of the Berlin Wall and normalization of relationships and glasnost and perestroika being kind of big deals. So yeah, what did I miss? What did I get wrong? Please go ahead and tell me how I mangled pronunciation of many of these things. Oh, that's what I should mention. Okay. So on my grandmother's side, I have my cousin Gregory. So I think the way it is, it's first cousin once removed, right? So my mom's cousin Gregory. He was really smart. I believe he still lives, so he probably is still smart. And he was really into fencing and became quite accomplished at fencing. And I believe he actually went to college for fencing and was looking to be part of the Olympics for fencing. However, he also went to college to learn Russian, of which he became fluent. So, wouldn't you know it? What happens if you are fluent in Russian? You might get a knock on your door one day. And it's going to be either you're going to come work for us and you're going to do translation, or you're working for them. And we might have a problem with that. And you're not going to represent our country in any kind of Olympics, or actually, was that the Olympics that would have been boycotted? Probably. But nevertheless, he got heat for being fluent in Russian. So I also had like 1 degree of separation of this craziness of the Cold War. So Gregory, if you're out there, hey man, shoot me a line. It's been probably 40 years since I've seen you. Hope you're doing well. Hope you've retained your Russian. Hopefully you're not like, I don't know, in some gulag somewhere. Anyway, what did I miss? Please let me know. You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, Gen X Podcast. Please like, comment, share, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.